read some books when I was very young, in my about 15 or 16, by a medical missionary. His name was Tom Dooley. I don't know, none of you, it's not the Tom Dooley who was hung. It's another Tom Dooley, and he was a naval doctor who worked in Southeast Asia. And these books were written back in the 1950s, and he, once discharged from the Navy, stayed in that area and worked, and actually died very young. If you were to go today to the grotto on the campus of Notre Dame, you would see a memorial to him. So I read those books and really decided I wanted to be a medical missionary. That's what I really felt that I was called to do. And that sense of being called to go somewhere that was strange and unusual and to work in that area was something that just really stuck with me through and still continues to stick with me. The goal in all this was really service. I really saw, and I viewed myself as a missionary. And a missionary, in my view, was somebody who went somewhere strange or unusual or foreign, and when one went to this strange or unusual or foreign place, that you went there to serve. You really went there to try to make the lives of individuals better. And in fact, I did become a medical missionary for a couple of years. I went to the United Republic of Cameroon, which is in West Africa, and worked as a bush doctor, operated a mobile clinic there. I would see anywhere between 120 and 300 patients a day. Really saw people very quickly. Treated tropical illnesses, and it turned out, though, that once I got there, I realized that basically what was needed in Africa was surgeons, because a good nurse practitioner could have done 95% of what I was doing. And so I soon realized that that wasn't the call for me. I wasn't being called to serve. Even though I dreamed of doing this for years and years, that ended up not being the call. But even before I went to Africa, I began to have an interest in psychiatry. And this idea of serving people who were suffering emotionally became a part of who I felt I was. And so when I went to Africa, along with my wife and my 8-month-old son, I packed about 50 or 60 books on psychiatry, everything I could find, into a barrel, and that was sent to Africa. And while I was in Africa for those 2 years, I read every one of them and just became more and more fascinated. So I returned from Africa, and I entered my residency at Duke. But when I came back, no one could have felt more out of place than I did. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So that's why, for me, initially, psychiatry, and even Duke for that matter, was really just about as foreign as Africa was foreign to me. It just seemed like I was in a very strange place. And psychiatry also seemed to be a very strange place for me. Just to give you a little of my own background. I come from a blue-collar background. My father never graduated from high school. I'm from the South. You can certainly tell that from my accent. There were no expectations that in my family that people would progress beyond perhaps a college education, and even that was not necessarily anticipated. And so I really did feel like that I was entering an area that was that I was not prepared for, and that it was very strange. Psychiatry at that time also seemed like a very strange area. Psychoanalysis, which is hardly even talked about today, was sort of a reigning theory in psychiatry, and I didn't really care so much about that myself, and so that became, another sense of, I felt sort of out of place in this. And but thankfully, Duke was a very eclectic department, and I felt very accepted in that department, and therefore I really began my psychiatric career and felt that, but I really felt like I had some things to kind of work out in that process. What happened during the next period of time, however, is what I want to talk to you about, and that is I realized that my entering psychiatry and working in psychiatry and having continued to work in psychiatry for well over 40 years now has been, to me, very similar in many ways to being a missionary in Africa. And so I gained some experience in Africa that I think applies to what my work in psychiatry can be. And so I want to talk a little bit about what those particular things might be. The first thing that I feel to be very important is you need to know who you are when you go into psychiatry or you go into any field in medicine. And so to have a sense of what your personal identity is, and then you work out from that. If you go in without that, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, it can be very threatening. So I've always, and since I can remember, at least since my college years, I've really kind of looked at my life as being one sort of like a ball. And in the very center is my faith. And I felt, the most important thing in my life is my faith. And on the outside of that would be my family. When I was married, when I had children, they were extremely valuable. Then I went to medical school and I became a physician, and then so I thought the next layer out was being a physician. And then later I became an academic physician, a psychiatrist, and that became sort of the next layer. I guess psychiatrist was the next layer, and then academic psychiatrist. Now it turns out that over my career, the vast majority of my time has been spent in that outer layer. In other words, being an academic psychiatrist. I mean, for the most of my career, I've worked 60 to 80 hours a week, and obviously that's where most of my effort goes. But I've always tried to remember that that outer layer really derives from what's inside. So I've really tried to always see myself as first a person of faith and second a person of family. Another way of looking at that for me has been, you could take away my academic psychiatry career, and that would hurt. You could take away my identity as a psychiatrist, and that would probably hurt even more. You could take away my identity as a physician, and that would hurt even more still. But if you took away my family, that would hurt in a tremendous way. And if I ever felt my faith was challenged in a way that I had difficulty working through it, that would be the worst challenge that I could imagine happening. So that's kind of how I've always looked at my life. And so given that, these are some of the things that I think have helped me through my career as an academic psychiatrist. So first, this is just some lessons that missionaries learn. And if they don't learn them, they can run into some difficulties. But all of these lessons are in the service of serving in an area, and also in the service is remembering who we are. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind. And I'm a Christian. That's my faith tradition. And that's where I start. And so I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we go along. So first thing, a missionary has to learn about the foreign country in which he or she serves. Now, this idea of rushing into a foreign country in Africa, I was already somewhat prepared to be careful about making harsh judgments or statements or coming quickly to conclusions, because I'd read a book when I was a teenager called The Ugly American. And that book really stuck in my mind. It's not a book any of you would have heard of unless you're very, very old. I don't know, John, you ever heard of this book? You were okay. So we've got at least one person who's there. So this is a story of it's a novel about individuals who served overseas or who had been overseas, and just what a terrible impression Americans made in some countries because they just did not understand the country. So I was very sensitive to this issue of, not rushing in and thinking I knew about everything and had everything to teach and nothing to learn. So I chose this go slow approach. I decided I'm not going to try to rush out and do so much, but I'm really going to try to learn the territory. I brought that same idea into psychiatry. Namely, I don't know this area well, and so before I start really thinking I know it, I better learn it. And I remember a colleague of mine who also was a Christian, came from a Christian background, who had a very different view. His idea was that he was going to get his psychiatry training, and he was immediately going to go back and sort of serve in the Christian community, which is a very noble profession. But his idea was that once he kind of got his basic training, he sort of left mainstream psychiatry and went into sort of popular writing and counseling, and there's nothing wrong with that, except it's sort of like I don't think he ever learned psychiatry. It's sort of like he left psychiatry as soon as he sort of got branded as a Duke resident in psychiatry, and then was off doing something else. And I realized how different an approach I took, because I decided I had just scratched the surface of psychiatry by the time I finished my residency. So I chose not to do writing for the public. I maybe did a little bit of that, but not very much at all. And decided soon after my residency that I was going to devote myself to an academic career, which meant I had even more that I had to learn over a much more period of time. I was curious, and I thought that was important. But the mission initially for me and the territory of psychiatry initially to me still remained somewhat foreign. And so I felt I had to kind of work my way through to try to understand better what it meant to be a psychiatrist. I did not want to be a missionary who was a flash in the pan. Come, think you're going to be doing a lot of things over a very short period of time, and then leave quickly. And I actually think now, today, there are many, many medical students who have some interest in global health. I'm just out of curiosity. How many of you have an interest in global health? See, now when I was in medical school, nobody would raise their hand except me. So this idea of having an interest in global health it's been a real plus, and I'm really happy to see that. The thing I guess I would warn is that don't just be a flash very quickly in this area. Take time to learn something about the territories you're going to go into in global health. That's very critical if you're going to be in this area. And so when I went to Africa, I spent a lot of time trying to learn, what it was about. And since I've been in psychiatry, I've really tried to learn what psychiatry is about. And I sort of, year after year, I've sort of, I think, gained more and more in this particular process. So what that led to was a sense that my vocation, my service, was not going to be necessarily to the general public. It was going to be to academic psychiatry. That's where I chose to serve. And so I kind of view myself in a way as a missionary to academic psychiatry, not a missionary trying to change academic psychiatry, except maybe in some ways I'd like to change it, just as Tracy was talking with you about before, about trying to maybe get spirituality more as part of the language that's there. But I really saw my area as being a service to academic psychiatry. Second lesson I learned, a missionary must learn the language. When I first went to Africa, I didn't speak the language. It turned out the language was a very easy language to learn because it's called Pidgin English. Pidgin English is a language in West Africa that uses English words, not always easily understood, but English words, but using a Bantu, a West African sentence structure. And so it took, after about 6 months, I could actually speak it. I could understand it within about 3 weeks. And then I thought if I understood it, I could speak it back. And it turns out it's the language of inflections, and it was a hard language to actually learn to speak, much, much harder than it was to hear. So I learned this language, and I realized that was extremely important for me to not only learn the language, but kind of learn deeper what the meaning of the language was. When I came back into psychiatry, I realized there was a language to learn. You in medical school are learning just incredibly new terms all the time. But it's not just learning the definitions of those languages, of those words. It's learning sort of the deeper meanings of the words and how you put those words together. And this takes patience. When I went into psychiatry, I had to think about how do I communicate with my fellow psychiatric residents and the faculty and so forth. And there was a language of psychoanalysis. There was a language also around that time called games people play. There was the language of behavioral therapy and B.F. Skinner. And getting these words right and kind of understanding what they meant and how they came together was a task, and you have to learn that language if you're going to be of service in the area. Today, in psychiatry, there's a new language, and it's not necessarily the sole language, but it's the dominant language, and it's the language of neuroscience. And so, throughout psychiatry, I've had to keep continuing to learn the language. I chose a research career, and as I went into a research career, I realized I had a language even more that I had to learn. I had to learn about empirical research. I had to learn about the language of methodology, about cases, controls, case finding. There was a whole series of words I had to catch on to. And getting those words not only into my vocabulary, but getting to the point where I could really understand them really became very important. And new terms appear over time. And then I think the spiritual task is finding ways to bring a spiritual language into what I do as a psychiatrist in a way that my fellow psychiatric colleagues can understand. So let me give you one example of that. I love to read outside, and I'll talk a little bit more of that in just a moment. But I started running across this term and some of the things I was reading called human flourishing. And it made no sense to me as a psychiatrist. Absolutely no sense whatsoever. I have a colleague, young colleague, who is theologically trained as well as being a psychiatrist, and he started using that term, and we talked back and forth, and I just kept saying, Warren, I don't understand what you mean by human flourishing. And we kept discussing it and kept discussing it. And finally, I began to grasp what he was talking about in terms of human flourishing. But I suspected that the vast majority of my colleagues in psychiatry had no idea what this idea of human flourishing might be and how that might relate to spirituality. So just recently, within the last 6 months, I was asked by an editor of a book to write a chapter on what was called positive social psychiatry. And so I said, aha. And so I asked my colleague Warren to join me in writing this chapter. I said, let's talk about human flourishing. Let's do that. And so it's an example of a way you can sort of, once you know the language of psychiatry, you can begin to bring in new words that can be meaningful within the field. And so this idea of learning the language and then bringing in new words, I think, is critical as you try to work out your spiritual life within this area that you're going to be spending so much time in. Another thing, missionaries must accept challenges, but they're not always the challenges we expect. Now, I think doctors in general, if they're thinking about practicing, really see themselves as having rescue fantasies. They're going to save people. They're going to heal people of their illnesses. And then very soon, doctors realize that they run up against disease processes. People continue to die. They cannot do anything about that. And that can become very, very discouraging. And I think there's almost kind of a little bit of a martyrdom sense. You know, we doctors, you know, are there to kind of try to alleviate pain in a situation sometimes that just is incurable. We can't do anything really about it. Missionaries also have rescue fantasies, but in addition, they have what I call persecution fantasies. There's just something about, you know, going to a foreign area. The idea would be that, you know, we're going to be challenged. Our safety is going to be challenged. And that's going to end up being a big problem for us. And there's actually some sort of excitement that comes from the idea that we're going to live a really tough life over there in this undeveloped area. When we went to Africa, nothing could have been farther from the truth. We lived very well, not rich, but we lived very well. We felt totally safe. Our son was sick for like a grand total of 3 days in the 2 years that we were in Africa. So the things we thought might happen didn't happen, but something did happen. We really were challenged with bureaucratic hassles and problems. In other words, working with the government, trying to do our work in the face of all sorts of regulations and rules that we didn't really understand well, etc. And that became a real drag and a real frustration. So I kind of learned that the challenges that I thought I was going to face turned out not to be the challenges that I did face, but the challenges that I did face were very real challenges even so. You're gonna face some challenges as doctors, and I can assure you that one of the major challenges you're going to face are bureaucratic and logistic changes. And a perfect example of that is the electronic medical record. I don't know what record they're using at some of the hospitals here, but we're using this new electronic medical record called Epic. Same here. It's horrible. I don't know what your thoughts are, but I just think it's really, really hard. And it's taken us longer. It's hard, you know, I think if Steve Jobs were to see the interface of that thing, he would probably turn over in his grave. It's just made life more difficult. And it was probably never the thing that you felt would be the major challenge. My son is a surgeon at Duke, and he faces some very real issues. And I asked him, I said, what's the number one thing that's the biggest frustration to you as a surgeon here, young surgeon here at Duke? He says, Epic. Number one, that's the biggest problem he faces. And so another lesson I learned as a missionary is that, yes, I will face problems in academic psychiatry, but they're not necessarily the problems I anticipated facing, like, you know, direct challenges to my faith, people cursing me, that didn't happen. In fact, Duke has been very good to me, but I certainly have faced challenges, and the bureaucratic challenges are one, but there are others that you just don't expect that you're going to have to face. Another lesson that I learned as a missionary is the need to keep some distance from what we do. When we went into Africa, it would have been easy to just get swallowed up into the culture because, you know, it was not a Western culture. So there was no TV to escape to, there was no radio to escape to, internet was not available at that time, years before internet. Relatively inexpensive phone calls were not. We made one phone call in the 2 years we were in Africa. That was it. So we really felt some distance from the culture we'd been in, and it would have been easy to just kind of get swallowed up in the culture in which we found ourselves. And I initially felt some tension. Some years later, I read a book that really helped me understand the tension of that sense of being swallowed up, and actually helped me understand some of my behavior that I engaged in while I was in Africa. This was not a book about missionaries, but a book about an anthropologist. It was a novel written by a woman who was an anthropologist. Her name is Laura Bohannon, but she wrote under the name of Eleanor Bowen. And she wrote a book called Return to Laughter. And this is a novel about a woman who is a newly minted anthropologist who goes into a very primitive village to kind of learn the behaviors of that particular village, an ethnographer. And in the process of that, she immediately immerses herself in the culture. And she finds herself really disturbed and really upset. And one time, initially she couldn't get the attention of individuals, and so she literally took a chair and set it right in the middle of the road where everybody was passing back and forth. And then things kind of turned around 180 degrees, and she was just inundated with individuals coming up, talking to her, interacting with her. She said, I couldn't get away. So then she decided what she had to do was to get away and find a way each day for a short period of time at least to get away. So she would retreat into her home, our little hut, and in her home, in that little hut, she had brought some Victorian novels, and she had brought an old recording device on which she played some classical music. And so every night she played classical music, and she read some novels. And she said that helped, in the novel, that helped maintain her sanity. When I first went into psychiatry, it's again an area where you can just be totally immersed with the culture. And I realized initially that I was beginning to kind of lose a sense of kind of who I was. And So how did I get some distance there? Well, I go to a church, a faith community, where there are no doctors, and I've made a group of friends. And these friends are really kind of a strange group, and you kind of think about the mix. An American Airlines pilot, a soil scientist, a high school football coach, a salesman at IBM, really quite a cross-section. But they're good friends, and I spend a lot of time with them, and they have no idea what I do as a psychiatrist, absolutely none. We play golf together, and we never are at a loss for something to talk about. We talk about our faith, our families, our kind of general challenges that we have, etc. And that's been one of the escapes that I have that's been extremely important to me. And I think in medicine, I think it's important to have your foot, as well as being in medicine, somewhat out of medicine as well, and finding ways to do that. And as missionaries, one of the things I did in Africa, after I'd been there for a period of time, is I had a tape of an old Henry Mancini group of music, and every night I played that tape over and over. I could almost memorize how each one of those songs go and which one follows the other, and I would read. And I would read something that had nothing to do with Africa. And so I think that idea of getting away is very important to helping us continue to maintain our sense of identity and who we are as we are in the midst or are literally surrounded. If you're on call for 12 or 15 hours a day, if you're in the hospital during that period of time, and the work that you have to do is totally dominating what you're doing, then I think finding some way to get away becomes very important. Another thing, a missionary needs to keep up intellectually with his or her own faith tradition. And so another habit I developed early on, and this is once I actually entered academic psychiatry, but I'd already started this when I was on the mission field, is I said, as I grow more in trying to understand medicine, psychiatry, research methods, etc., I don't want to leave my education in my faith tradition behind. And so literally for the last 40 years, I spend an hour a day reading theology, reading philosophy, reading books about my faith, reading the scriptures. I spend that time every single day, and that's perhaps the most valuable time by myself every day. And I think, and I'm not formally trained in any of these areas, none. But what this does for me, and I don't have a really good memory, and so putting those two things together, it's not like I can sit here and tell you what a lot of these readings actually say. So I can't even remember who the authors are half the time. But they leave impressions. And those impressions, I think, keep me kind of feeling that I'm growing intellectually in my faith tradition, just like I'm hopefully growing intellectually as an academic psychiatrist. And so that's, to me, has been very important. And finally, I think a missionary has to remember that we are in service. I don't think there's any good reason to be a doctor other than wanting to help people. I mean, if you really think about it, yes, you can make a reasonable living, but that's getting a little tougher. You're going to come out of medical school, or many of you will come out of medical school with considerable debt, and that's going to make it difficult. You're going to work some fairly long hours, and that's going to make life difficult. The status of doctors is not what it once was, and that's going to make life a little more difficult. I think if you really get down to the core of it, you probably are here in medicine because you want to serve. You want to help people, and you want to help people who are suffering from illnesses. And that idea of service very much, as I said, it initially sort of came from my work in missionary. But one little nuance to this idea of service. And again, I'm an academic psychiatrist, so I'm going to kind of take this in two sort of parallel examples. When we were in Africa, I saw a lot of patients. As I said, sometimes I saw up to 300 a day. And those days often were just a blur. 2 days later, if you ask me, tell me about an interesting case you saw 2 days ago, I couldn't do it. I'd seen so many that I really couldn't tell you about the interesting case. Now, let's fast forward 40 plus years. And here I am, an academic psychiatrist. As Tracy mentioned, I've participated in over 440 peer-reviewed publications. I've authored or edited 35 plus books. Now, if you sat me down and says, tell me what you found in this particular paper that you were first author on in 1993, I would really be hard-pressed to do that. Okay? I mean, I just frankly would not remember. It's my work. I think it's useful work. I go back and read it, and I said, that was actually pretty good. But do I remember that? No. Let me tell you what I remember. I remember the faculty members who come to me and will ask me sometimes for some advice, and I can give them some advice that helps them, and they come back and say, you talked to me a couple of months ago, and that really has helped me kind of get out of this little mini crisis that I was in. I remember certain patient interactions where somebody comes in with significant problems, and something happens in that interaction that seems to click, and that patient comes back and says, I'm doing considerably better now. Those are the things that you remember about your service. And so don't count service in numbers. Count service in those unique kind of experiences that you have, because I think that again gets back to who spiritually we are. We're spiritual individuals who I think at base sort of like to work one-to-one, and those one-to-one interactions will be the ones I think that we will best remember. So I'm going to stop now and just give this. Hopefully this has been a little overview of somebody who I said had a little bit more of a unique kind of career, at least at the beginning, than many others. But I am a very traditional academic psychiatrist, academic physician at the present time. I do all the things that academic clinicians do, and so here I am. So I'm happy to answer any questions or have you make any comments. Yes. I always did private practice. It's interesting, I'm 70. Duke has a rule. You cannot practice after the age of 70. So
my question is, how do you feel like your practice with individual patients was different than your colleagues who were not explicitly searching to integrate their spirituality into their vocational system?
So I think that's a complex question, but I think they're kind of, let me give you maybe one insight into it that hopefully will help from my perspective. And I think everybody is somewhat different in this. So virtually everybody at Duke knows I'm Christian. And so I've had many patients referred to me who are Christian. And I come from an evangelical Christian background, and most of our area is evangelical Christian, so that's kind of a natural mix. The thing that's a little bit surprising is that many people who I've seen throughout my career have sort of they wanted the assurance that I came from the same faith background that they came from. And that was the end of it. After that, we did not talk about faith. We talked about their symptoms, we talked about their problems at jobs, we talked about their difficulties in their marriage, etc. So to some extent, I was just kind of I think I was kind of used as sort of an assurance that, I was not somebody who was just totally different from them, and I think there's this underlying fear sometimes that people are going to shake you out of your faith. And so that I kind of alleviated that fear, though it was interesting that we would rarely talk about that. And that's one group, okay, so that's one group. But then I think there's another thing that happens, and this gets back to language. And I think that coming from my background that would be similar to many of my patients' background, since we shared a language and since we shared a culture, I think we could talk easier and with more understanding about certain issues that may not directly relate to their faith path, but certainly did relate. Now, what I have not done in my practice, though some people do, I've not been overtly evangelistic in my practice. I've just chosen not to do that. I've not felt like, for me personally, that was an approach to take. So I haven't gotten into many discussions. I've had a few patients over the years who've come to me who really are searching spiritually, I think, as much as anything else, and so and that's been a very rewarding kind of work to work with those individuals who are searching. But I didn't ask the questions. They were coming asking the questions initially. So I guess I would say that my spirituality kind of pervades everything I do, and I think that is affecting everything I'm involved in my practice. But if you watched me, you may not be able to pick it up very clearly. I think it happens at a different level.
What about the cases where your patients are agnostic or atheist?
When they know who I am, they know where I come from, and we work from there. They come to me because they think I can help them, and so we work from there. I don't try to change their faith. I really don't try to change their faith. I really try to work with them where they are. I might point out if they are feeling a sense of emptiness or something like that, that I certainly recognize their, where they're coming from, and say, are you feeling an emptiness? Do you think you need to search? I can remember very clearly one young man who came to me and was in a sort of an existential crisis because he had been an atheist, and he all of a sudden was having just the sense that he was lost in the universe. And so we had some long discussions about sort of how he might sort of find his way out of that. But that, interestingly, has been actually somewhat unusual. Okay. Someone else? Yes. Mm-hmm.
What has made your faith so strong and pervasive?
Well, I don't know. I would not be the person who would say my faith is a strong faith. I hope it is, but I think that was true of me probably came out of my family. I think that was true of me easily from my teenage years, and I was probably one of those weird teenagers who never had a crisis, and I really do say weird because it just I just kind of. Life kind of went along fairly smoothly, and it just was never an area where I really felt challenged or doubted. One thing that helped is that before I went to medical school, I actually did take some divinity school courses, and I took some courses at Vanderbilt, and there I was hearing things that seemed very, very strange to me, given my background. And I had a friend of mine who was also a student at Vanderbilt Divinity School, but who was from my background, and we talked at some length about some of these challenges. But they really weren't challenges that challenged my faith. It was more I just didn't quite understand how to answer those questions. And he was very helpful in working with me, answering some of the questions that I had at the time. This was before I went to medical school. Okay. So, yes? Mm-hmm.
Well, you mentioned how psychiatry is kind of moving more towards neuroscience.
Yes.
Often very reductionistic and focused humanistic. And I wonder if you could talk about what your thoughts on that generally, and then how you personally try to where you want to go.
Well, so that's an excellent question. It's one I'm thinking about a lot at this particular point in time. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm an epidemiologist, and that's my research area. And actually even a social epidemiologist, and so I'm kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum. I would say that I think I have real concerns about psychiatry becoming overly reductionistic. I have very real concerns about that. The difficulty many times is that it's not an explicit statement about The mind is only the brain. I mean, it's rare that you'll hear something like that. But what you will hear, you won't hear anything about anything except the brain. And so trying to get people to recognize individuals have a spiritual side, for example, as well as a biological side, but not being dualistic in that, I think, is probably the route that I've tried to take in some of the discussions that I have. And so, I mean, I really do feel that we're embodied souls. I mean, that's the best way I can describe it. And I look at it from the perspective of the patients that I treat or have treated, and they don't look upon themselves as being just a brain. I mean, they really look upon themselves as having a soul, as being challenged at the very core of their being, their personality, etc. So I think for me, one way I can speak back to my colleagues is to have them reflect on the kind of conversations they have with their patients. And you might say, you just suffer from a depression, and that's the problem. It's a biological issue, it's a chemical imbalance, and we can correct that perhaps with a medication. That may be in some ways correct, but it's not the same as coming into an emergency room with pain in your abdomen and the doctor saying, oh, we just did an ultrasound on you and you have gallstones and we think that you've got a gallbladder attack and we need to get that gallbladder out. The experience of psychiatric illness is very different than the experience, I think, of many medical illnesses. And it affects people at different places. Though I wouldn't suggest that other illnesses don't have a soulful aspect to them as well. But psychiatry especially, I think. So that's sort of the way I come at it. And I've been doing more writing about this. I've been thinking about it more, about the importance of considering these things. And I've also been interested in the social environment and how that plays a role in this as well. So I think you're right on target. This is a potential problem. But it's a subtle message that comes from psychiatry, but it's a very strong one. Other thoughts or questions? Yes?
You briefly mentioned or touched upon a little bit. I'm a pathologist. I work in South India.
Okay.
So in the villages that we work, they are really poor people.
Yes.
And just establishing labs with atmosphere was the leading thing for me. I started getting involved in learning about the community. There's alcoholism, depression, but what I also saw was there's this really good grasp of faith, or whatever we used to say, Hinduism. So I thought that, okay, there could be a subset of the population who are poor, maybe illiterate, but they are happy. And so is it possible to create this happy, poor community? And so I came back and talked to Paul Farmer, Joanne. So the group of physicians here think that alleviation of poverty is the first step in and access to health care. But do you think spirituality can be some sort of a back road to making healthy community?
I mean, absolutely, but I think what's maybe equally important in your story is, are you Indian in background?
Yes.
Okay, so you, unlike many people who are going from a different culture into that, you know that culture, and you've taken the time to listen and try to understand the culture. And and the term I used before, you've gone slow. You've kind of moved slow, and you've learned things. And I think that, and one of the things you've learned is that spirituality very, very well may have a role. And you're seeing individuals who are very poor, but who seem to be very happy and content. Interestingly, I saw the very same thing when I was in Africa. Some of the happiest people I've ever known have been people in Africa, and I haven't understood why. But I realized that, and I saw some of these happy people begin to sort of get seduced by certain Western draws, and that would end up making them pretty miserable. And so that I was there long enough to see that potential problem. So I think you're hitting on something that's extremely important, and that is taking your time, figuring out not only what's not working and where you might be able to intervene and help, but also what's working and what kind of support systems within the culture are there, and work from there.
But it's not a popular concept, though. The doctors who, both locally as well as here, do not think, so the people there locally think that those poor and suffering are meant to suffer, and you really cannot relieve their suffering by talking about spirituality.
Yeah.
And I think there's this concept of high spirituality, low spirituality. So I came back and started reading a lot about what it means to be spiritual. The psychiatrists have the spirituality scale, which I thought was utter nonsense. So I couldn't apply that to the things that I was working with. So, but I don't know how to go about doing it.
I think you're saying exactly what one of the things I would say, and that is, go slow and just keep learning. I mean, I think that go slow and keep learning, and some of this, I think, very well may come to the fore. You know your culture very well, but you're finding things in your culture that seem strange to you, and you don't quite know what to do. And you're also a doctor, and you want to try to help, and your goal is to try to relieve suffering in some way, and trying to find a way that you can meld those two things together, I think, is extremely important. And so you're kind of in a position to do just that, I think. So I would just, I don't have advice, I have encouragement. Just keep at it. Someone else. Yes.
You mentioned some of how you approached bringing your faith into academic practice, which we talked the last question about ways of patients as well. In terms of some of the academic environment, interaction with colleagues, even with politics and academics, are there any times that you're more conflict of faith with also psychiatry or the academic approach?
Well, in the general academic approach, it's very individualistic, it's very competitive, and sometimes it's not always honest. And so I think probably at a kind of a very basic level, I've decided I'm going to play by the rules. I'm going to try to not be, you do have to compete for things like grants, etc., but I'm really going to try to be a friend of the people I work with. It's interesting, I noticed that one way some academics can kind of downplay other academics is not to cite their works. So they're writing an article on a particular topic. It's amazing how they will omit certain individuals who have contributed majorly to that topic because they see that individual as a competitor. I've always made an effort to try to never omit somebody who has something relevant to say. So there are ways that happens. So that is one place. I think if you take it to the next level, just beyond kind of the competition, etc., I think that it's important that you take the research questions that you're working on, the problems that you're facing, and step back and say, so now, is this compatible with who I am and what I believe? And I think there are certain research endeavors that may not be. And I've tried to ask that question. I'm in a little bit easier area. I'm not an interventionalist. I'm really more of a natural history person, and so it's a little bit easier for me to do it, being somebody who looks at, natural history, longitudinal studies of people in natural settings. But I do ask questions about, are the questions that my team and I have been asking over decades now, are they in any way sort of going against what I think to be true to who I see myself being? So I think that's the second level that you really have to look at, and I think that can happen if you're a molecular biologist. It may seem that what you're doing is so far removed from your faith that there's just absolutely no connection whatsoever. However, I think it's very interesting that the head of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins, who was obviously very key in developing in the Human Genome Project, really felt compelled to write a book on trying to understand his own faith background in relationship to his research. And so I think that's a third level, and I kind of feel like that's kind of the next story of my life, the next chapter of my life is that third level, is really trying to see how has all this research related directly to my faith and kind of bring them together at even higher level. So I think it's those three levels, just the kind of the ethics and honesty of doing the work, and the fairness initially. Second, really challenging the questions and seeing, do these questions really fit with how I believe? And not that you bias research to try to find answers that will support you, but that's not the answer. It's really more the questions you ask. And then third, maybe kind of an ultimate integration. And I think actually that sort of goes through one's career, maybe not sequentially, but I think they sort of come one somewhat after the other. Anyone else? I know we're getting near the end of our time. Listen, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me here. And you have a good weekend. Don't study too much. Okay.